For the most part, video games don't really have individual directors whose releases you regularly look forward to like you would a new Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino film. There are a few exceptions, of course, and Hideo Kojima's name no doubt sprang to mind after hearing that sentence, but for the most part it's entire game studios which occupy the same role as directors in movies, either becoming known for a certain franchise or style of gaming experience, or for their creative risks and gripping storytelling. As a result, names like ROCKSTAR, Naughty Dog, and FROMSOFTWARE hold the same clout as Hitchcock, Kubrick, and Scorsese. But while they become often synonymous with their most popular products, there are plenty of overlooked games from these industry giants that deserve to be remembered just as much. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 incredibly underrated video games from landmark developers. Number 10. Spider-Man: Web of Shadows, TREYARCH. TREYARCH spent the back half of the 2000s earning the right to be the lead developer on Activision's world-conquering Call of Duty franchise. However, before they slogged through harsh dev cycles on sequels nobody liked to finally prove themselves with World at War and Black Ops, they were also in charge of the publisher's Spider-Man games. For the most part, these were kind of hit and miss, with huge successes like Spider-Man 2 sharing shelf space with disasters like Spider-Man 3. Web of Shadows was the devs' final attempt at the franchise before they were put on Call of Duty full-time, and Activision pretty much buried it despite it being one of the very best Spidey games out there. Though it wasn't very polished, this original superhero tale about a symbiote invasion featured a whole bunch of other Marvel heroes and villains, and boasted inventive aerial combat and thrilling swinging. The franchise is probably in better hands now, but Treyarch's final effort shouldn't be ignored. Number 9. MDK2 BioWare. Before they were mainstream big hitters, BioWare were nerd favorites. Adapting the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop formula into Neverwinter Nights and then Baldur's Gate, the company had plenty of established, much-loved franchises under their belt before they were given a Star Wars game to work on. But it's MDK2 which deserves more recognition. At the time, this was a bit of a departure for the RPG makers, being an action-adventure shooter that lent far more heavily on comedy than serious fantasy storytelling. Still, the change in direction worked, and it laid the foundation for the wackier, character-driven side of future BioWare titles. Also, there's a bit where you can fart into a fire pit and blow an entire space station up. With You Stink, remaster this, cowards. Come on, I want to do the and then. Number 8. Brothers in Arms: Hell's Highway, GEARBOX. GEARBOX has a weird reputation in 2020. On the one hand, they're the people responsible for the beloved Borderlands series, but they're also the villains who gave us the utter train wreck that was Aliens, Colonial Marines, and of course Duke Nukem Forever. In between those big properties though was Brothers in Arms, the World War II shooter that really launched GEARBOX to success in the 2000s. Sadly, it hasn't had the same pop culture staying power as the likes of Medal of Honor, which is a huge shame because the final installment, Hell's Highway, was a killer war game that told a surprisingly human story. Sadly, it came out at a time where the world had gotten well and truly sick of World War II shooters, and even its gripping cinematic story and gritty squad-based firefights couldn't pry players away from the clutches of Call of Duty 4. Hell's Highway deserved way more attention, and it sucks that we've got a whole generation without any kind of proper follow-up. Number 7. Apocalypse, Neversoft. Of all the studios that have either been shuttered or reduced to support teams, Neversoft still stings. This was the team that essentially defined the late 90s and early 2000s with the Tony Hawk skateboarding games and a brilliant Spider-Man PS1 title, and that influence extends to one forgotten release which came out a year before they hit the big time. Apocalypse isn't a game that gets brought up often, if ever, and I don't think there's going to be any petitions to see it remastered anytime soon, but for a kid growing up in the late 1990s, it was the kind of cool, violent shooter you dream about when you went to bed at night. For one, it had mother-hugging Bruce Willis as the star, who'd announce to the enemies he was about to shoot / explode / set on fire / vaporize that he was about to open up a can of whoop-ass. Now, that might not sound like the most badass thing, but back at the time when I was about 4 years old, that was next-level stuff. Also, it had this dystopian, oppressive steampunk aesthetic that was so cool back in the 90s as well, and even better, there's a bit where System of a Down plays a song and a video on a big television screen while you're shooting dudes. This is like the perfect game for Scott Tailford. And thinking about it now, it was kind of like that Bone Storm game from The Simpsons, and it absolutely knocked my socks off. Number 6, Resistance 3, INSOMNIAC. On their rise to superstardom, INSOMNIAC games became known for a very specific style of game. Colourful platformers bursting with personality defined their releases across the PS1 and PS2 era, with Spyro the Dragon and Ratchet & Clank both achieving mainstream popularity. When it came to thinking up a new franchise for the PS3 though, like their peers, INSOMNIAC opted for something a little bit darker and mature in tone, swapping out the cuddly anthropomorphic animals for regular old human protagonists and collecting gems for shooting a colonizing alien force in the face. Resistance was intended to be the PS3's next big killer app. However, it wasn't an instant smash hit like Ratchet or Spyro, and that's because the wild genre switch evidently took INSOMNIAC some getting used to. By the time the third game came around though, those rough edges had well and truly been smoothed out, but at that point the world had moved on. Consequently, most players, even those who bought into the past 2 games, missed out on the very best Resistance installment and one of the best shooters of that generation. The fact Killzone got to continue and this didn't is a travesty, though it is hard to argue that INSOMNIAC haven't moved on to bigger and better things with Spider-Man. Number 5, Ninja Blade, FROMSOFTWARE. FROMSOFTWARE got big after dropping Dark Souls, which, through word of mouth, became a bona fide pop culture phenomenon. However, the company had been making games for decades prior, though not all were of the same quality. Still, from King's Field to Armored Core, there were still some series which made waves in the gaming sphere. The imaginatively titled Ninja Blade, though, was not one of them. A mere month before the studio launched Demon's Souls, they also released this forgotten action game, which took more than a few cues from Ninja Gaiden. Set in a dystopian modern day, players were cast as this leather-clad warrior with the goal of stopping an infection that transformed entire populations into grotesque monsters. Just a quick glance at the gameplay shows how similar it was to other action titles of the time, but it still boasted some interesting ideas. Some, such as needing to perform a finishing blow on bosses after whittling down their health bar, would even turn up in later From releases like Sekiro. It's nothing too special now, but Ninja Blade is a solid cinematic action extravaganza from a studio who would change gears radically months after it launched. Number 4, Uncharted Golden Abyss, Sony Bend. The PS Vita completely died on its arse, but the handheld console didn't deserve half the hate aimed at it. The majority of PlayStation fans didn't bother picking it up though, and that meant so many great exclusive games ended up being sent out to an uncaring void, doomed to be instantly forgotten. Alright, it was more like a handful of great games, but still enough to lament their fates. Uncharted Golden Abyss was one of these killer apps, and even though it wasn't created by Naughty Dog, Nathan Drake's side adventure still retained the same sense of spectacle that defined the main series, and surprisingly lost little in being scaled down so much. The prequel launched at a time where developers Sony Bend were at something of a crossroads though. The franchise they were known for, Siphon Filter, had come to an end, and the team spent the next generation supporting Sony handhelds. It wasn't the most glamorous position, but it did ensure that those machines received some stellar games, and even now Golden Abyss is a must-play for Uncharted fans. In fact, it's a crime that Sony didn't include it on the remastered collection. Number 3, Transformers Devastation, PLATINUMGAMES. PLATINUMGAMES rose to prominence over the 2010s thanks to their extravagantly wild action games with Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, props to making that name not dumb and actually badass, and Nier Automata occupying a starving space other developers had more or less retreated from. However, once they became a known and trusted quantity, the increased popularity saw the developer take on way too many projects at once, to the point where the team dropped 3 big titles in 2016. With the sheer volume of capital C content being pumped out, it's understandable that some hidden gems were lost between the more popular franchise staples and the controversial stinkers. Transformers Devastation was one of these, a colourful beat-em-up based on everyone's favourite robots in disguise. It didn't have a lot of depth, but by aping the classic cartoon style via gorgeous cel-shaded visuals and delivering weighty, spectacular combat, it proved a dream come true for Transformers fans who were enjoying a string of great tie-in titles around that time. Number 2, Oni, Bungie. Bungie spent an entire decade changing the face of console first-person shooters forever with Halo, but a year prior to Combat Evolved, they launched Oni, which couldn't have been more different from that other series if it tried. This fun-as-hell third-person action game prioritized martial arts as its primary method of combat, styling itself on huge anime hits like Ghost in the Shell. From the near-future setting and weaponry to the clearly anime-inspired heroine, Oni doesn't feel dated today like so many trend followers from the time, because it wasn't just ripping off its influences, but blending them into something distinctly new. Throw in some open, exploration-driven levels, rudimentary stealth mechanics, and increasingly over-the-top fistfights, and Oni becomes an example of where Bungie may have ended up had Halo not taken off as much as it did. Number 1. The Warriors, ROCKSTAR. Despite regularly pumping out high-profile success stories in established franchises like Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption, ROCKSTAR have always found time to craft passion projects. When it was announced that the iconic publisher was going to be releasing a table tennis game, for instance, everyone in the world wondered why. The joke was on those naysayers though, as it turned out to be just about the best ping pong game ever, though how much competition there is for that is admittedly unclear. And in fact, ROCKSTAR's table tennis could have made it onto this list, but The Warriors is a game every fan of the developer needs to play. The license tie-in wasn't just made to cash in on a movie, because the movie itself was already over 25 years old by the time it came out, but rather to act as a love letter to the source material. This was an adaptation nobody knew they needed, but the gang brawling combined with the authentically captured 70s movie setting worked a treat and provided a great alternative to the modern mayhem of GTA. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Are there any underrated games from excellent developers you think need more recognition? And while you're down there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't know, I've been Josh. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.